Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our last week discussing Jacquard's web. Uh,
Yep.
it's it's really flown by. I don't know about you, but I feel like we just started a couple weeks ago.
Well, right now it's actually sort of nice outside here at Redstone Glen, and we were just commenting. It's still daylight, which
Yes,
is
the
what
first time it's
what.
daylight.
Yeah. So this is great.
And we do have some folks joining us here. Someone is joining us from Disney. Lucky you. I'm sure you're having much better weather than we are. We have some folks joining us from New Jersey. And we're going to get it kicked off talking tonight about chapters 15 and 16, which is sort of the wrap up that brings us to what all of us have experienced, at least in our lifetime,
That's true. Yeah.
as far as computers going forward. And I have to say that when we first start out and they're talking about some of the technologies that were being co-created at the same time as like the tabulator machines,
Right.
like Edison, it sort of brings stuff to the forefront that I had not made connections between.
What's even and of course I'm older than you are, but I felt the same way. It was something like I couldn't sort of grasp. Although I sort of remember radios and television sets.
Yeah.
My parents, your grandparents, had an old Motorola television set, and if something rolled underneath and behind the television, you went back there, you could actually see the glass tubes in there.
Right.
And oh my gosh, we recently bought a television set, and it's an inch thick. You're like, how?
Where is everything? How's this
And the
working?
clarity. So we're going to be talking about pixelation
All
and on the
kinds of fun
clarity thing.
stuff.
But oh my gosh, that old television set with Gilligan's Island and the
Right.
vacuum tubes in the back.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
how different.
Now, one thing we start right off the bat is talking about the Edison effect. And I think Essinger did a good job sort of putting this into perspective that his invention with his light bulbs was one that would prove one of a crucial discovery, right, in technology that made it are possible in the modern world, okay? And some of the things that he's talking about are these links between the electric source and this, what do we want to say, data processing that we've been working toward was a perfect connection. I was actually able to find a lot of really great information in this engineering website, which is bringing sort of to the forefront all of these wonderful things that happened in conjunction with him discovering the Edison effect. And so I encourage you guys to go on and read a little bit more about that.
And how one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another.
Oh, yeah,
in there.
definitely.
Yeah. And those light bulbs. What I find fascinating is that today, and people are going to LED lighting. First of all, it's very efficient. The lighting is beautiful. But
You
there
can
is a
choose,
surge.
do you want daylight or do you want
yeah.
museum mode or,
Yeah.
I like that.
But the trend in interior lighting right now is to go to chandeliers with Edison bulbs. They want to see these big bulbs with a little filament in
Right.
there.
Glowing almost orange in color.
Yeah.
Producing mood lighting, but not necessarily one that we would want to work by as crafters.
But I thought, how fascinating is this whole
Come
thing?
right back around to
everything
it.
comes right back around again. So.
Exactly. Now, we were also introduced after sort of basically understanding how the light bulb came to be. And if you're really interested in more information, those two sources I just provided can give you a lot of good information. But there were also two gentlemen that were working at the University of Pennsylvania called Eckert and Malchi. And I thought it was interesting that they brought these two up because, of course, it all starts in academia. There are brilliant minds working to create connections and also innovations. But anything big always tends to get noticed by the U.S. government if they feel like they can use it to their advantage. And so they were actually contracted by the government to improve some new tabulations that were much more accurate to benefit their ballistics technologies and understanding the weight and the speed and how they can accurately project its target over very, very long distances. And for most of us, that might be a generous sort of eye roll because it's not of interest to us, but the math needed to be perfect, and they were able to come up with technologies to help support that goal.
Well, still think about all that mathematics and how you calculate that. And how do you know when you send a rocket up into space, how it knows to go to the moon and then turn around and come back and not just miss the planet by. It's not like you've got a steering wheel.
Yeah.
I mean, it all has to be mathematically calculated
Right.
out. Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one of the first pieces of technology that came out of this research was called the ENIAC. And the ENIAC sort of reminds me of the old switchboard systems where you're pulling cords and you're moving connections from one circuit to the other. Now, this has actually been part of a restoration project over the last couple years that was done by Penn Museum, where they're actually making efforts to clean it. And why I say making efforts, I'm hoping it's done by now because this article was written in 2011. But here in this article, you can see how students and researchers are working together as conservationists. And I'm laughing at this because when I think of a conservationist, that's okay. Yeah, we all have like the postnasal drip thing going on now.
Yeah.
But when I think of conservation work, I think of architecture, I think of paintings that have faded or have had water damage.
And things certainly a whole lot older than what this is.
But here, what they're doing is they're looking at these old technologies, trying to preserve them so that they better understand the future.
Wow.
Yeah. So I encourage you to go on and do a little bit of additional reading. But of course, the ENAC was the main invention that they put out there first to help process some of these much more complicated tabulations. Very shortly later, and shortly I'm meaning a year later, because technology is moving fast, they came up with the BINAC. And the BINAC was a little bit different in its operation, that it had this sort of cylindrical type build to it, and all of these tubes were coming off of the cylinders. And I love that I found this neat old article. It says, "Want to buy a brain?"
Yeah.
And it shows all these really complicated technologies. But look at the scale of the machine. There, it shows you a little guy standing down here. And I'm guessing this might be 24, 30 feet long.
Oh my gosh, it's huge.
But compared to the first computer we were looking at, thinking the Mach 1, that was, 55 feet long? Yeah.
This is much smaller in scale.
And of course, they don't slow down, and they eventually move on to the UNIVAC. And this was what they called the UNIVAC because it was truly a universal automatic calculator. It was the most reliable, it was the most sophisticated, and its technology received tons of patents between the years of 1948 and 1966. It just blew competition out of the water as far as the speed in which it could calculate. Even their earlier sort of attempts at this, compared to the Mark I, the Mark I could process things at like 3 operations per second. And some of the earlier ENACs were processing things upwards of 5,000 operations a second.
What a jump.
So what a huge jump in what we're looking at, like maybe a 20-year span.
Man, oh day.
Yeah, pretty interesting stuff. And I have to say, when we talk about these technologies, I look at those pictures and they all look completely archaic to me because I was born into a world where we had computers available to us as elementary school students. And so relatively, I didn't get the same sort of linear sort of observation as technologies have grown over the past at least, 30 plus years.
You probably came in with the floppy disk where you put it inside.
I did. I know.
The
We had
tower.
floppy disks right off the bat as soon as we were able to start using those technologies. Now, those tubes were wonderful. They solved a lot of problems. Speed was flying like crazy, but they still had to be manufactured. They took up a lot of space, I would say. And so they started looking at other sort of technologies. And one of the things they started working with were called transistors. And although they started the development as early as 1947, they didn't see it on the market until almost 1960. So it was a long time in development. But it had some unique semiconductors that allowed it to be a much smaller footprint. They were solid, and there was no vacuuming needed to keep the gases sort of intact.
And when one failed, some of you are going to remember this. If you had the television with the tubes in the back, when one failed, you would see immediately that it had turned black.
Right.
And everything else, and the guy would come to repair it, and repair that particular tube and stick it back into your
That's
television
interesting.
set.
Now, could you go down to your hardware store and do that sort of job yourself, or was that a really specialized thing?
I think
that
it was
had to
pretty
be
much
done?
a specialized thing.
Okay,
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Sort of like when you got to take it to the geeks and have them,
Oh yeah.
you know, take your motherboard out so that you can get the information off of it. So as the transistors sort of made their way into mainstream, I don't think the tubes ever fell out of popularity. In fact, when I was doing some research, there's a whole following of folks that are still collecting things like
Look at
tube
that.
technologies. And they hold conventions where they get together and they sort of share information, as well as display technology that uses these tubes. I guess there's a collector for everything out there. But
Of course there is. I mean, how funny is that?
right,
Yeah.
right.
Don't you want to meet these people?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now, there's also something that sort of follows directly after that, right? We have transistors. It's good, but it's still not fast enough. It still takes up a lot of space. And so now we've sort of entered the realm of microchips. And microchips are something that we hear in common conversation all the time now. But there was a time period where this was new to the front of technology. And for many of us who sort of have always had it in their periphery, I really wanted to know better how they were created. So this is a fantastic website. I am so impressed by the design of it. And I guess if you are teaching about microchips, you probably should have a pretty great website yourself. But if you get a chance to sort of toggle over to this website, they not only have a wonderful slideshow that gives you an idea step by step of the manufacturing process, but you also get a look into the facilities in which it's made and the ultra sterile environment that they're created.
Spacesuits.
Spacesuits.
Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about clean and they talk about they're exposing them to photosensitive, there are blue lights in. Oh my gosh, there is so much cool information in here. But basically what they do is they layer lots of levels of information and they store them on these very, very tiny packages. You know, when we first started talking way back in the day about Babbage and also some of the technologies that he had dreamt up, they never came to fruition because they couldn't make enough intricate cogs and wheels to bring the analytical machine to reality. Can you imagine if he was able to see a microchip and just how the microchip is made to put into the computer? He would be astounded just to walk into the laboratory, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
And see everything around, let alone lasers storing information.
And how tiny they are, and just
Yeah.
all the
Yeah. So at this point, our punch card systems have fallen to the wayside. In fact, I think that I saw that IBM created their last punch card in 1984.
Wow.
Right. Which made sense that it didn't really...
It was obsolete.
It was obsolete.
They had moved on.
Yeah.
Yep.
But, you know, in some ways that's good because they're working away. I mean, even though things were compressed down into smaller packages, they were still storing tons and tons and tons of cards because that's where the information was stored. And I think that was another really sort of interesting observation that I made is, you know, we go from floppy disks to hard disks to CDs. Now we're moving to USB flash drives and even the cloud storage. But what goes hand in hand with all of those technologies is the ability to read that information.
That's true.
If I put a whole bunch of floppy disks in my children's hand tomorrow, they would have no clue what they were holding, let alone have in their periphery a piece of equipment that could read the information that came off of it.
That's right.
And so in some ways, it's great to store all that information, but unless all that initial information was continually upgraded to the next format, we need to keep continuing moving to a cloud-based sort of format so that it's there forever and ever.
And then just the idea that that even exists and that you can send it out there for storage and then retrieve it.
That's right. Yeah. Now, I was glad that Estiner also included a timeline of other sort of key points that were happening in history at this point. And one of the things that they were talking about was Hewlett-Packard. And I know you're not really like a computer guy, but
But I do know the
everybody.
name Hewlett
But
Packard.
you do know
yeah.
the name Hewlett Packard, and I found a website that goes over their entire history, everything from the shed or the garage that they started in Silicon Valley in 1939, all the way through some of the timeline of their time together, how Hewlett and Packard met and became friends and started this business, as well as a timeline that takes us through some of the technologies that they've developed over many, many years at this point.
And you can see some of the things
Oops,
on
excuse me.
that little list that look
Yeah,
rather familiar.
I don't know about
Yeah.
those. These are starting
No.
to look more familiar.
The
but
calculator.
The calculators. Now we finally have those handheld calculators. We're starting to see, home use video cameras that are available for the general public
Yeah.
to purchase, which is pretty nice.
Yeah,
So,
could Hewlett and Packard have ever known in that little garage what a huge company they would grow into
yeah,
and how
yeah.
it would change the world?
Yep. Now there's actually, I think there's actually an opportunity for folks to go and look at the original garage in 2007 that actually went through a restoration process so that it looked very much like the original garage that they would
My
have started
gosh.
in. Yeah.
And you were telling me it is in Silicon Valley.
It is in Silicon
Like,
Valley,
bit of
so like they were the original tech founders
yeah.
there. Yeah. Now, these connections between computers and weaving just keep going back and forth. We keep circling back to it again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And when the author brought to mind the idea of pictures or picture elements, what we now refer to as pixels,
Mm-hmm.
and relating it back to weaving, it made perfect sense. When you think about pixels and how they are actually interpreted by the eye, I think it depends on the medium that you're talking about. When you sort of toggle over to the comments section, Deb's going to include a website called Pixels Explained. And this is a website that goes into sort of the color theory. It talks about some of the scaling options and how it actually relates to some of the physical units. I'm also going to have her include this neat YouTube video. This gentleman does such a great job in 4 minutes talking about the history of pixels, back to those old tube televisions that you were describing earlier, to our modern LCD screens and how they have pixels, but they might vary in shape depending on how the light is projected onto those pixels. In shape, yeah.
Oh, that's
in fact, I don't know if I can get into it at the very end of the video or not, but yeah, some of the, oh yes, here, I'll play a little snippet for you all to see. There we go.
Today, pixels come in a variety of shapes and sizes on a variety of screens, like plasma, OLED, and LCD displays, which have rendered CRTs mostly obsolete. Pixels have continued to get smaller and smaller with better frame rates and better color depth.
So this guy does a really good job at sort of doing explaining in common speech that anybody can understand. So if you want more information, it's a nice way. But for us as weavers, we see things kind of differently.
On a grid.
Yeah, on a grid.
Perpendicular lines.
This is a really common pattern that most weavers will recognize. Anybody from rigid heddle through the most advanced structures. Log cabin is something that weavers embrace because it's a simple structure in plain weave, but it gives really great optical illusions. And when we start looking at it closer versus at a distance, we start seeing a thread for thread interlacement all the way down to a grid format.
Wow, look at that.
Okay? And this is a really good way to illustrate what it looks like when the choice is made. Remember, we have two options, regardless if we're talking about computers or plain weave here. We're either going to have a warp thread raised or a warp thread lowered. And that's going to tell us if the warp is going to be showing or the weft is showing based on when our shuttle is passed. And I think weavers can really understand that option of yes or no. And when we talk about many lines building on top of each other for the whole composition, it's very much now relatable to the images that are creating by pixels on a display screen that we have in front of us.
And in our world, I mean, it's really quite gross and large in comparison to a television set.
Definitely.
But I always thought it was just like tiny little circular dots. That is such an interesting.
Yeah, sometimes you see them in sort of like a honeycomb or
Yeah.
beehive shape. But yeah, some of them are very narrow, some are sort of oblong shaped, and sometimes more color, or one color gets more representation than another, depending on the light source.
So when I'm looking at it and putting it in my own sort of terms, so some of you might get this, I'm just thinking like a tapestry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to get a curved line, you have to just build that up ever so carefully.
Correct.
And they're doing the same thing in printing or in television.
Isn't that so
Yeah.
interesting? Yeah. Now, when we get into pixels, of course, the technology is constantly increasing. And sometimes when a new technology comes out, they boast it so proudly, like now available in 4K or
Yeah.
5K. You're like, I don't know, it's a bigger number. It must be better. But
Exactly.
most
Marketing.
times what they're doing is they're referring to the image that's created and the number of colors that the eye is be able to perceive and how much smaller that information is getting. Yeah. Now, we have to sort of recognize as we start looking into other things and where the future of technology is taking us. Esther brought up things like AI.
Yes, indeed. Computers, when you think about artificial intelligence, and unlike the human mind behaves, at least it is solving problems for you. So you're not doing it all yourself. These machines are now programmed to be able to solve some of those. And it looks like part of that is, it looks like Bitcoins.
Yeah, so one of the things that this sort of illustrates is that AI is working towards a future where they are able to perform many jobs that humans do. Sometimes eliminating the human element might be pretty helpful. For instance, in like the example of the doctor, AI can only do what it's been programmed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So unlike a human where they spend a lot of time in medical school memorizing things and trying to retain that information, a computer is designed to only do that and to flawlessly recall it without making errors.
So you don't have to constantly be
No.
researching that again. It's already taking
Easy to
part of
update, easy
Yeah.
to reference, not just the text you read in college, but perhaps the text that was created by somebody in India, another person who was a traditional medicine man, and they can reference lots of different sources to come up with the most complete, comprehensive treatment.
and share it.
Yeah, and when it comes to things like investments,
Excuse me.
again, our minds are limited by what we know currently. I can see AI being really amazing for investments because it is well versed in understanding the most current trends. It would not use emotion, as
Yeah.
far as investments, but pure rationale and statistics, and things like customer service. We all like to talk to a human over the phone, but sometimes not hearing the other person's emotion behind their voice might be very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me. And AI is one of those things that can be kind of fearful, I think.
Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah.
going towards the future, as long as you understand the technology and know that most of them, when used for very specific purposes, can't do things beyond that. Remember, they can only do what they're programmed to do. Of course, there's always the mad scientist idea out there where they can start
Oh.
thinking for themselves.
Yep.
But linear thoughts are produced by, complex thoughts, but they still lack the human, which is creativity and trying to think in a more obscure thought
So
versus linear.
we're a few steps away from having a computer rule the world.
I hope not.
Yeah.
I hope not. Now, there's one thing they didn't touch upon in the book that has always sort of been of interest to me. Many years ago, I heard of a company, some scientists that were working in Southampton, England, and it was something called the Superman crystal. And it is a 5D memory crystal. I was actually able to find a YouTube video that explains it really well. Again, she has sort of dumbed it down for the common person to understand. But if you can sort of imagine a very thin sheet of crystal where they are not only printing information lengthwise, but width and height-wise, and then looking at different perspective, you can actually create a 5-dimensional type informational storage. And the size of these crystals are about the size of maybe like a quarter, I would say. And they're able to store something like 360 terabytes worth of information on them. And for those of you who sort of have a hard time sort of getting that perspective, I have this giant box sitting on my desk, which is an external hard drive, and I store videos on there. It has 5 terabytes on it, and I thought that was like a crazy amount for storing information, including the things that I don't ever want to lose. But the cool thing about these crystals is that they are made of a material that will outlive humans as we know it. They're talking about things like will last more than 13.8 billion years. They're fire retardant. And aside from taking a hammer to it, they're indestructible.
So your box holds 5?
I think it's 5 or 7 terabytes.
And this is 350?
I think 360 terabytes on this little tiny thing. And the technology is sort of coming to a point where they're now using this to memorialize mankind. They're putting things like Bibles and Aristotle and Shakespeare and everything that has shaped human civilization onto these and basically sending it out into space so that if our planet somehow blows up, something crashes into it, humankind's history will be recorded forever.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that just so interesting?
It is.
So I encourage you to check out not only the YouTube video, but also the website. I mean, when it comes down to it, you can definitely sort of go out there. They're even saying that you can store all of your memories for eternity. So if it's important for you to make sure that, I don't know, your family tree is recorded forever and ever, you can completely do that. Yeah.
And your family and your neighbor's family and their families and
mankind in general. Exactly right. So we have sort of taken it full spectrum from Jacquard, who was a small boy sitting at a draw loom with his dad, spending hours toiling away, pulling cords to create this beautiful ornate fabric. We have come full circle around to this idea that technology has taken us far further than any person who's even in that field could have imagined 40 years ago. And I think that's just so great.
Gosh.
Yeah. Now, talking about the future is fun, but it is sort of limited by one's own imagination and probably your own goals. But there are some people here today that are still completely embracing history for what it is.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. Melissa Weaver Dunning, who is a wonderful teacher, was here this week teaching a class. And since she's following along with some of the Jacquard talks we've had, she had to share with me some information about a young man. His name is Justin Scurso, and he does live up in Vermont. And Justin has a love affair with all things that are Jacquard, and he actually works on an old barn frame loom at his home, and he creates these beautiful Jacquard pieces.
It looks just like the coverlets that we saw last Sunday.
At the Coverlet Museum, right? And so Justin's workshop has the barn loom, of course, with the Jacquard head mounted on top, just like the one I showed you pictures of, and a series of cards that work their way over, repeating his pattern. And his studio is pretty traditional in every shape and form, including the way that the materials are prepared and some of the other tools that he uses.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that wonderful?
Hats off to Justin.
Yeah, hats off to Justin. And Melissa was also very good about getting me information about Justin if you're wanting more information. Here is his website. It's called the Burroughs Garret, and you can find information about Jacquard on here. You can look at sort of his pieces that he makes, and even get in touch with him if you want more information.
Field trip
to Vermont.
Yeah.
We love cool people that are doing cool things.
I know. That is fantastic.
Yeah. But I think it's great that even though we're able to come up with all these fantastic things, there are still people out there that just like to make for
Mhm.
maker's sake. And although he's using what we would consider outdated equipment, he's still producing things far more complicated than most of us are weaving
Are
at home.
able to do.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yes. Well, I don't know about you, but I have thoroughly enjoyed this book. I knew it wasn't going to be your favorite with the
Oh, I love the
with
beginning of
tech.
it. The tech part
beginning of
was,
it.
a little hard for me to comprehend,
okay.
but I learned a lot from it.
Yeah.
So
I'm
thank you.
interested to hear from folks in the comment section what you love most about this book. Again, people are going to go back and read these comments days after the broadcast is over. Perhaps they're going to go back and watch it years later, as I'm finding people are doing now with the Golden Thread and the Indigo Girl. So please make sure that if you have other information that you want to contribute to the conversation, that you include it in the comments section. And that includes other websites that maybe you have found in your research, or pictures that you want to share from coverlets in your collection. It's all good
Yeah.
stuff.
This week during Melissa's class,
Mhm.
I can't tell you, Sarah, how many times people came up and said, love the book club, love the Indigo Girl, learned so much about that.
Yeah.
I can't believe I was in Charleston and I forgot to, look that up. It just came
Check
to
in with the
and check
homestead.
it. Oh my gosh. So I think these are rather important that when we do these things. But yeah, if you've got ideas of books that you think people are going to, let us know.
Yeah. So Sandra K. Miller has a question. She wanted to know if we would bring him down for a class. We could certainly reach out to him, but I think for the best experience, Sandra, I would reach out to him because it looks like he does offer some classes at his studio, and he's got that wonderful Jacquard head there, so it makes a lot of sense to just go right to him.
I don't know that
I know.
that loom is going to be disassembled.
It does
and brought,
not travel easily, I'm
No.
sure. But yeah, from what I hear from Melissa, he's a really wonderful young man, and you would thoroughly enjoy his facilities.
It'd be fun to see.
Yeah, but good question. Now we are wrapping up. This is our last week for Jacquard's Web. And how it goes in the future, we don't know yet. So what we hope to do is continue to keep in touch with you through some of our social media. Of course, like we continue to post them on YouTube. And of course, Pinterest and Instagram are one of my favorites to go and post more up-to-date information. I think we will make an announcement probably midsummer to see what our fall is going to look like. Of course, we've got two trips to Scotland coming up in September and October, where we will be taking 50 of us to Scotland to look at fabrics and all things that Scotland can provide.
Yeah.
But I'm still hoping to do maybe even just a little bit. Maybe we do a small book club at the end of October, beginning of November, if that works for folks. But we really do enjoy doing this as much as you like being here. So if you have suggestions, feel free to email them to me, put them in our comments section, because let's face it, you guys like to talk about the same kind of stuff we like. So anything you want to share is good.
We've enjoyed it.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week and all that springtime is going to bring.
Yeah.
See
Take
you
care.
soon.
Good night.